Hi folks, my name's Gheeotine and welcome to today's build showcase. But today isn't just a normal showcase. Today I wanted to tell a story. A story of curiosity, adjusting expectations, and hardship. A story of what might quite possibly be the stupidest computer I have ever built. Why are you still zooming in on? It all started a few months ago, about February if my sales records are to be believed. I was browsing eBay for computer parts, as I tend to do, when I stumbled across a motherboard that I found myself amused by. It was an unbranded, dual CPU socket, reduced form factor motherboard being supplied by a Chinese seller. While I'd never built a dual CPU PC, I wasn't entirely unfamiliar with them. I'd seen videos of other builds that used them for enthusiasts or an industrial capacity. Interesting to a degree, but not something I had any need or want to indulge in at the time. I was aware of their shortcomings and was quite content with my current array of machines, but this motherboard was different. If nothing else, I thought it was kind of funny. The sheer density of the components that were needed in order to fit everything on the board, it had to make concessions such as only having 2 RAM slots for CPUs that were quad channel, and positioning various ports into odd orientations. It stuck with me, and eventually, as with my 4-way SLI machine and my Steam box, I began to research parts. Time passed, pieces began to trickle in, and in mid-April, I popped and bought one of the motherboards. However, by this point I'd also decided to set a gimmick with this build with 3 primary stipulations. 1. A reduced form factor to take advantage of the MATX size of the motherboard. 2. Dual CPUs, obviously. And finally, to coincide with the year of tribute to SLI, 3. I wanted multiple GPUs. This presented an interesting challenge, though. The motherboard only has a single full PCIe slot, and the other slot would require a single slot card if I wanted to hope for multiple graphics cards. But let's focus on my phrasing. I wanted multiple GPUs. This didn't necessarily mean I needed more than one card, though. You see, in my research, I stumbled into the now-defunct world of dual GPU cards. Graphics cards that have 2 GPU cores on a single PCB. From what research I've done, the last generation of nvidia graphics cards to have multiple GPUs on one card was the 700 generation. The last card specifically was the nvidia Titan Z. And every time I say it, I feel like speaking like the narrator from Dragon Ball.
What game will we be rendering today on today's exciting episode of nvidia Titan Z?
The Titan Z, released in 2014, is an impressive card, basically being 2 nvidia Titan Black cards themselves were higher clocked 780 Ti cards with more VRAM. Speaking of VRAM, the Z had 6 GB for each GPU on the board. So 12 GB? Well, yes, but no, it's not pooled. Each GPU only uses its designated 6 GB because it has to load its own copy of the necessary data so they can render the alternating frames. Oh, also they cost approximately $3,000 at launch. $4,000 today when adjusted for inflation. All this information aside, I was initially going to use a GTX 690, but ended up buying a Titan Z during a bout of fever, which heavily compromised my budgetary discretion. I say that because even with the price deflation of better cards coming over the years, Titan Zs still cost over $300. Card in hand, I now had most of what I needed for this build, except the motherboard. You see, my board had been ordered right before the waves of tariff announcements, backtracks, reinstatements, and all manners of fiscal idiocy from our president. Anyway, while it was shipping, all manner of other industries were responding by changing shipment manifests and practices, and my board got caught up in the shuffle. From placing my order to when it arrived, it took over a month and a half to straighten things out. And all that time, I was stewing on a few concerns. First was the hope that I'd be able to test all the other parts in time to ensure eBay buyer protections had my back. Those other parts consisted of an EVGA 850-watt semi-modular power supply, 32 GB of 1600 megatransfer DDR3 ECC RAM, a set of 4 Xeon E5 2667 V2 CPUs, and an SP 1TB 3rd Gen NVMe drive. I also ordered some cheap air coolers and a really cheap MATX case. Those parts would come back to bite me. Parts testing wasn't necessarily my only concern, though. My whole build rested on the premise that I'd be able to use the Titan Z, but I had no idea if it would work. You see, even a multi-GPU on one card setup needs the board to be compatible with SLI. the nvidia proprietary tech that allowed nvidia cards to communicate. However, I had no idea if this janky, unbranded motherboard would work. The seller assured me it did, but I've been taken for a ride by shady eBay sellers before, eager to make a sale, then run for the hills once they got my cash. But finally, after much anxiety, the parts all arrived and the build began. As I put the machine together, I was fixated on this compatibility question. When it was assembled enough to put to testing, I bridged the power pins with a screwdriver. Fans sprang to life and the board made a series of chirps to indicate it seemed to want to function. However, there was no video signal. For the next 10 minutes, I troubleshooted. Different GPUs, reseating the memory, swapping different CPUs out. Nothing seemed to work. About to give up for the day, I swapped monitor inputs by using an adapter.
Alright, out of much testing and very stupid circumstance, trying to get this thing to post for the sake of testing, not going, nothing's working. It was the f***ing monitor! So, intended card, testing now. If it gets to the screen as I've been testing it the way it should be going now, then we will move on to putting it into the case. Holy shit, I'm pissed off. This is mainly to test to see if this board will function with dual GPU graphics cards. The GPU is on. The DVI cable is in. Power is live. Where's my screwdriver? I put in the proper RAM. Alright, we have power, we have fans, we have storage drive, we have beep. Do we have signal? We have signal! Ladies and gentlemen, this f***ing setup works! Ooh, I'm excited now. This is the stupidest machine I could have ever conceived.
Having now established that, yes, the board was SLI compatible in spite of only having space for one card, I moved on to installing everything in the case. Unfortunately, in spite of my primary worries now being placated, my troubles were only beginning. You see, the main factor I had not yet accounted for was going to be the pain in my side for the doubler's next few incarnations. The Titan Z, when under full load, draws 375 watts, and each CPU draws allegedly around 130 watts. This meant one thing: heat, and lots of it. And I just threw all of that into a case with terrible intake ventilation, with two janky and cheap 80mm air coolers. I'm probably lucky I didn't burn my apartment down. To illustrate how much this wasn't going to work, even though I hadn't yet realized it, the doubler kept crashing due to heat, even when just installing Windows. Over the coming days, I attempted to make things work. The biggest modification being a big fuck-off hole in the front and installing a 140mm intake fan. It did a fair bit to help, and I did love the aesthetic, but it would still lose stability under full load for less than a minute. Trial and erroring my way through testing, I eventually came to a conclusion. I was going to have to buck some of my usual preferences in PC building and shift aesthetic styles. As much as I like the option of built-in disk drives, I needed to go for a fish tank style case due to their heavy emphasis on air exchange. Finding a decent one on Amazon, I did the case swap. While things improved, it still wasn't great. For the last potential optimization, I decided I was going to use a part I don't typically like. I was going to use all-in-one liquid coolers on the CPUs. I don't like AIOs for a few reasons, one being that, long story short, I had a night of tinkering and upgrades almost ruin my daily driver after the AIO failed. Nevertheless, I had to acknowledge that their performance would likely be necessary in taming this beast. So, acquiring two Thermalright Aqua Elite 120 V3 coolers along with an array of fans, I put the doubler into what is likely its final configuration. So, let's give it a good look. So here it is in all its glory, the machine I've been working on for the past 2 months, the PC born of all my worst impulses and my insidious curiosities, the doubler. Before we get into its performance, I wanted to also establish a basis of comparison. After all, this beast is, in many ways, the components of two PCs working in unison for more power. So I threw together another machine, also with a janky Chinese motherboard, but with half of almost everything compared to the doubler. Half the doubler. The singler? We'll workshop it. Anyway, the Normie has the same CPU, a GTX 780 Ti with 3GB of VRAM, 16GB of ECC DDR3, a 500GB NVMe, and 3 fans, not including the CPU cooler. So let's begin some benchmarking to see if we really have double the performance. To directly set up a CPU comparison, I dabbled in Cinebench for the first time. Running the multi-core test, it scored 6,603, 1 point above the i7 7700K. That's interesting to me for a few reasons. First, the Xeon here is about 2 years older than the 7700K. On the other hand, it has double the core and thread count. By my own standards, a 7700K is perfectly usable, and I actually run one in my alternate dimension sleeper. I upgraded. Looking for a price comparison, the 7700K regularly lists for about $70 on eBay. In contrast, I got 4 of these Xeons for an average cost of less than $6 per CPU. If you don't mind janky motherboards and understand that gaming performance may not be as optimized, these aren't too bad. Deciding to use a game that'll hopefully lean heavy on the processor, I broke out City Skylines and downloaded the benchmark test by Uvier on the community workshop. Observing the city up close, things looked odd to me. Not the game though. The game actually looked halfway decent, and the GPU was barely seeing 40% use on high settings. No, the thing that looked off was the MSI Afterburner stat reading in the upper corner. It was continually reading an FPS of 15 to 25, but it didn't feel anything like that. I mean, you're looking at the same screen I was looking at. What FPS does that feel like to you? Station to Station, for its mellow atmosphere and relaxed pace, can lean quite heavy on the graphics hardware. This was evident when I was scrolling around environments and placing tracks at around 25 FPS. Being the chill title it was perfectly playable and didn't look too bad either. I'm not expecting much of an upturn though when we get to the Titan Z, since Station to Station has no SLI support. Moving to our suite of built-in game bench tests, Shadow of the Tomb Raider on high settings averaged around 46 FPS, showing the age of a 12-year-old flagship class card. Then again, the low was always above 30 FPS, and interestingly, on the CPU front it was showing similar load to Cities Skylines in the busier moments. Still, for hardware that's averaging over a decade in age, the performance is better than I'd expected. Far Cry 5 under its own bench test was best described as rigid and stable. The low being 44 FPS and the high being 55 FPS in ultra settings meant that regardless of what you were doing, you were going to stay within playable territory. Middle-earth Shadow of War's bench test brought out a fair degree of confusion. On ultra settings, the run looked like it would facilitate a fine playthrough, but for specific stats, Afterburner was feeding me one set of frames, and the built-in test was feeding me another. Which do I look at? Looking at these highs and lows, I'm inclined to believe Afterburner, but I've rarely encountered scenarios where the data feeds disagree. What do you think I should read here? Moving on to gameplay observations, Half-Life 2 started off with a casual 300 frames per second on high. I'm not sure I believe it after the last game's readings, but as far as controlling and playing it, I have no complaints. Wreckfest, while tolerable in the very start, validated my sentiments from the Steam vs. Windows video that the frames were going to suffer while jostling for position in the pack at the start of each race. At 24 FPS lows, we fought our way to the front of that pack, and once there, 60 to an excess of 80 was within view. Lower the details from Ultra like where I had it, and I bet the opening fight to move up in the field would be a little bit more consistent. But finally, how does the Lonely Singler handle Crisis? Well, Ultra settings in Crisis 2 was once again stable and consistent, locking to what looked like an even narrower range than the Far Cry 5 benchmark, seemingly never dropping below 50, but also never going above 56. Convenient, since it never reached the need to remove the built-in frame rate cap of 65 FPS. So there's a foundation for a simple, weak, uncomplicated computer. However, that's not why we're here today. We're here to bask in the glory of a computer with over double the capacity in every respect. A Chad computer with the ability to destroy anything laid before it as far as games are concerned. After all, a computer you have to fight to tame is far more worth it than any one that just works as intended right out of the box. Right? Starting off with Cinebench, a quick 1-minute test shows that it indeed scales appropriately, literally doubling the score and putting it within 3,000 points of a first-generation Threadripper. Let's run a longer test and see how it crashed. Alright, that's just Cinebench. Let's see how it does with some actual gaming load. Cities Skylines. What? Alright, I feel like there are some shenanigans going on here. First of all, this does not look or feel like 15 FPS to me. This feels better, but it's not telling me it's better, and it's pissing me off. It's almost like the two CPUs are screwing with me, akin to that two gatekeepers riddle. One of us computes the truth,
The other renders only lies.
On the other hand, if the CPU loads are to be believed, it's not really taxing the CPUs any more than before. Instead, the load has just been scaled inversely, being split evenly over the increased CPU capacity. Station to station was just about the same. The CPUs were doing less individual work, and the Titan Z was only using one GPU core. Although, looking at the two workloads, I get an image in my head of two neighbors. One sweating their ass off, working in the summer heat, and the other looking over the fence, enjoying a lemonade, and thinking to themselves, wow, he certainly looks like he's working hard over there. Shadow of the Tomb Raider scaled quite well. The frame rates didn't quite double, but they were close. The CPU loads also indicated they were taking on more work for the heavier sections. Deciding to move over into gameplay for a moment, it was rather smooth, and I could see myself doing my playthrough on this machine. It crashed. With Far Cry 5, I have to ask one question. Why you gotta be like that? Running in the same lane as the 4-way SLI test, say it with me, highs were higher, and lows were lower. But hey, at least it's consistent. Middle-earth Shadow of War's bench test was once again a battle of selecting which dataset to believe. Diverging frame measurements and conflicting information aside, it looked perfectly fine. It didn't scale well though. Definitely not double the performance. Hell, if the Middle-earth data is accurate, performance was just straight up worse in every respect. Half-Life 2 was almost completely unchanged. The only discernible difference was that the CPU load was now lower, being spread across 16 cores and 32 threads as opposed to the 8 cores and 16 threads from before. I also gotta wonder if there's a secondary cap in there for 300 FPS. No complaints though. And finally, Crysis 2 again. Now this is what I'm talking about. This is a sales pitch. Frame rates didn't just double, at times, they tripled. If ever someone wants to show the potential of a multi-anything build, be it GPU and now possibly CPU, Crysis 2 Maximum Edition would be my go-to. But I want to say a few things before we end for today. First of all, while one of the most irritating builds I've ever done, this was also one of the most fun. I love building PCs where I have the opportunity to learn about various tech implementations, and this one gave me plenty of opportunities and is still giving them to me. I'm still navigating my way through the overly simplistic BIOS, and if anyone knows any ways that I might be able to increase stability given the options presented here, please reach out to me. However, for gaming, this PC is not good. It's unstable, it's hot, it's power hungry, and I'm not sure what to do with it now. I'm definitely not selling it. I wouldn't feel comfortable sending a machine that I worked on that's this unstable out into the world. If anything, maybe I'll try it out down the line for some video editing or rendering. Nonetheless, as far as goals I had starting out when I decided on this project, I'd say I mostly succeeded. It's a dual CPU, dual GPU machine in a reduced form factor. It's the stupidest machine I've ever built. It's the Doubler, and I adore it. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.